Okay, thanks, guys. It's good for you to come back again. I'm still a bit discombobulated with the time. I actually thought the lecture started 2 hours ago because I didn't set my clocks properly last night. But anyway, so look, speaking with you yesterday, what I realized is that the thing I most enjoy doing is talking with people, not at people. And so, today I really want to leave time for your questions, for any comments you have, even if they're a bit on the edge of the subject matter. And I'll try to make sure we have time just to do that, because I really, personally, I enjoy that more than talking to a computer screen. When I'm lecturing to people in person, I see people, I see their faces, and I also see if they're falling asleep, as a matter of fact. And actually yesterday we talked about, the name of Edward Edinger came up, who was a very prominent analyst in New York, and then for a long time at the C.G. Jung Institute in Los Angeles. And I believe some of you, of the older folks here, knew Ed pretty well. I never met him, but I know a lot about him. I've talked to people. Well, my main complaint about Dr. Edinger is he almost killed me once. Edinger was if you've read his books, which really started for the most part as transcriptions of his lectures, they're quite erudite, but his speaking style was rather dry and somewhat monotone. And I was driving back from the desert after a long camping trip with my family, coming down a very lonely, narrow road between Green River and Price, barren road, listening with my wife to Edinger's lectures on Mysterium Conjunctionis. And after about an hour of this, I fell asleep. The problem was I was also driving. And as I started at 70 miles an hour, swerving off the road, my wife screamed just in time for me to avoid killing us all. So, and I always attribute my near death to Edward Edinger. And as I thought about my first lecture to you guys, which was somewhat dense, I realized that I might have killed somebody with that lecture. So I'm going to try not to do that today. So, stay awake, watch where you're driving. So, yesterday, a couple of questions came up in our discussion that I really wanted to just turn to and start with today. Let me see if I can I'm going to start my screen share, see if that works. Yep. So yesterday, Claire Julian asked a question about the Sophianic image, and we talked a little bit about, I think Christoph asked a question about God's image, was Philemon Jung's God image. Let me just start here with Philemon. There. So Philemon presented himself to Jung as a very real and intense fact, a personage who spoke. This picture here on the screen, Jung painted in 1924 in his Red Book. And yesterday in the lecture note I gave, I mentioned that Philemon had come back to him in a dream as he was starting to write Aion. Jung had addressed him he addressed him in face of him as Domine, non sum dignus. Lord, I'm not worthy to crawl into bed with you, this prophet figure. So, and Christoph yesterday asked me about the shroud of Turin, if that image which Jung had in his office was his God image, and if that was Philemon, because it certainly looks a bit like the face Jung painted on Philemon. I should also add that in his tower in Bollingen around 1924 or thereafter, Jung painted a full wall mural of Philemon in the upstairs, small upstairs bedroom, which I actually have seen. I mentioned yesterday that Jung talked about Philemon to Carrie Baines, who was one of his dear friends, around 1923, about the time this painting was actually done. And Carrie Baines was a physician. She was one of the first female doctors, actually, graduated from Johns Hopkins back around, I think she graduated as a doctor in 2011 and ended up in Zurich. And Carrie was a very rational person. And she became a really good friend of Jung's. And Jung actually asked her to do a new transcription of the Red Book. So she had been through all this stuff. She actually did a new transcription of the Red Book from the Red Book text itself into TypeScript. And so Jung was talking to her about what had happened to him. And Carrie, after their conversations, Carrie would go home always and type up notes of what Jung had said to her. And this is what she wrote. There were various figures speaking, Elias, Father Philemon, etc. But all appeared to be phases of what you thought ought to be called the master. You, she's saying here, you were sure that this latter was the same who inspired Buddha, Mani, Christ, Muhammad, all those who may be said to have communed with God. That gives you a pretty good idea of how intensely he felt this relationship with Philemon to be. He was really a logos, a higher consciousness, speaking independently, telling him things he did not know. And well, there you have it. This latter, Philemon, was the same who inspired Buddha, Mani, Christ, Muhammad, all those who may be said to have communed with God. That really is in intimate, personal dialogue. In 1923, how Jung was able to describe this. And you don't find that in his collected works, obviously. That's not how he talked about these things in public forums. I think for very, very clear, very good, very easily understandable reasons. This is part of the part of Jung, which I talked about, the part that he really had never revealed. In the Red Book, that image I showed you of, let me go back one more thing. If you look at the picture of Philemon here, at the picture, I think you can see there's Jung has inscribed in Greek words at the top of this image. And what it says is Philemon, the father of the prophets, which very much is in accord with what he told Carrie Baines, Philemon. Or actually in Greek, what it says is the father of the prophets, Philemon. Right to the side of Philemon in the Red Book, let's see if you can see this. Over here at the side, you'll see an inscription. It's the only inscription in English that Jung put in the Red Book. And I don't know when he added this particular statement to the image of Philemon, but this is what it says. It's a quotation, and I'll read it to you. It says, the Bhagavad Gita says, whenever there is a decline of the law and an increase in iniquity, then I put forth myself for the rescue of the pious and for the destruction of evildoers. For the establishment of the law, I am born in every age. This is Krishna speaking in the Bhagavad Gita. And I think that pretty much also is an indication of how Jung was feeling what was happening to her. I use this word revelation. Look, I know this is a little bit difficult for people in Jung studies, or at least in Jung analytic psychology. But Jung really felt that we had started a new age, or were about to in the next 100 or so years. And that what had come to it was a keynote for the changing image of the divine that will descend upon human consciousness if we survive over the next 100 or 200 years. It will be the end of the Christian Aion, and the beginning of something else. But he also felt this age we are entering is really in a nascent stage, and there's going to be great disruption, great turmoil during this period of the reorienting of human consciousness. And then Claire Julian asked about this image, or asked about, the image of the feminine. And let me show you again these images. These are on facing pages of 154, 155. He did both of these around 1924, and he placed them here side by side with good reason. The reason, the image of the feminine, well, I've heard people talk about the Red Book saying this is his soul, or this is his anima. Look closely at that picture, and you'll notice the text around it. You'll notice that it looks like almost an altar in a church. And in the crowd below, there are some who were seeing it, looking, pointing. Even one here with a cap of a Catholic priest and album on. And then others who were turned away, taking no notice of her. To understand who she is, this image, one really should read what it says around the edges of it, what he inscribed. It says, De sapientia in mysterio. The wisdom of God in mystery, even the hidden wisdom, which God ordained from before the world unto our glory. The Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God. On either side of the arch, around the veiled feminine figure, he offers words from the Revelation of John, chapter 22. Spiritus et sponsa dicit, vene, et qui audet dicit, vene. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let him that heareth say, come. And let him that is athirst come. And whoever will, let him take the water of life freely. That's what this is all saying here from, the Revelation of John. And then what you can't see quite clearly or so well, above the columns, there are two little angelic figures. See them up here? There's an inscription on them. And what it says is, Ave Virgo Virginum. Praise Virgin of Virgins. Marianic image? Well, a feminine image. And Sophia, and Sapientia, that's another name for Sophia, which was a figure that became very, very important to Jung, especially as spoken in Answer to Job after Aion. He really felt that the Christian age had missed something in the lack of consolidation of the image of Logos with Sophia, particularly in Protestant form of the Logos praise. So yesterday I had intended, we'll talk about that. You can ask me anything you want about that in a minute. Yesterday I had intended to start reading a little bit about from the text of Aion itself, which is important. And I mentioned that when Jung started writing this, he said I didn't really know where I was going for the first 25 pages that I wrote this. And some of the stuff he wrote about included the concept of the shadow. And I don't want to say much about this, other than just to point out to you something that I'm going to talk about in a little while, which I think is very important. Jung wrote in this early section of Aion about the shadow. He says, with a little self-criticism, one can see through the shadow, so far as its nature is personal. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. A rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. Well, that was where Jung's gaze fell on January 12th of 1914 and January 18th of 1914, documented in his journal and in Liber Novus. Of the experience he wrote in Liber Novus, this is the night in which all the dams broke, where what was previously solid moved, where stones turned into serpents, and everything living froze. Jung's sense of the absolute reality of evil, absolute evil, evil that even exists as the shadow of God, perhaps even as part of the conjunctio, the union of divinity, would soon occupy him in later sections of the book. The first time I read Liber Novus, I was not really surprised by Liber Novus when I found it, because I'd been looking forward to it and expecting it for a good long time, and I'd already had a pretty good idea what was going to be in it. The first time I read through it, though, this section, how deeply he went into the darkness, well, I didn't see it. I was looking too much at the light. The second time I went through it, preparing for a series of, well, actually a year-long seminar I did. Some of you, I think, here were there for that seminar. When I got to this section, I was really shaken. I really saw it. I remember that night after I talked about the lecture, I went home and I was still dealing with it. And as I tried to go to bed, I saw this great big eye. If you're familiar with the work of Tolkien, it really reminded me of the eye of Sauron. And as I looked at it, it became increasingly real. And it seemed to be drawing light. And it was absolutely shattering. And I knew that I was looking as best possible in image at the reality of the eye of evil. And I really just had to shake myself to draw myself away from that image and not be drawn into it, just as Frodo might have been in The Lord of the Rings when he looked into the eye of Sauron. The next section talked about anima and animus. We talked about that a little bit. And he talked about this in the beginning of Aion very briefly. He had talked about it much more extensively in the book he had just finished reading before his illness in 1944, which was called The Psychology of the Transference. But Jung understood after his visions in 1944, which were as I've tried to make clear, a tremendous transformative event in his life, in late life, at age 69. Jung later wrote, at the beginning of the illness, I had the feeling that there was something wrong with my attitude. He went on, the fracture of my fibula, his ankle, which led to his pulmonary embolism and his near death. The fracture of my fibula was highly symbolic to me. I asked myself for some time where my fault lay. After a while, I found out. I had transpassed into foreign territory. It is as if one were walking in one's garden after dark and fallen into a hole. I had written about anima and animus, believing I was just working with psychology. But I had transgressed into God's country. Alchemy had seemed to me to be a legitimate branch of science, but its contents, anima, animus, the self, the alchemical marriage, are not simply scientific concepts. They are gods. Together they form a divine pair. Both of them, anima and animus, are unconscious powers, gods in fact, as the ancients would quite rightly conceive them. To call them by this name is to give them that central position in the scale of psychological values, which has always been theirs, whether consciously acknowledged or not. So, we yesterday in our discussion, I talked a little bit about anima and animus as the projection of something inside of us upon another, that the human could be led to an experience of the fact of the anima or animus through interaction with another individual upon whom he has or she has passed this projection and retracted the projection back and seen, oh my God, here it is. What Jung is making clear in those comments after his illness is that these things are, to the sense that they are not just projections, they're archetypal figures inherent in the background, in the formation of our consciousness. They are a duality. They're a duality which I think he presented on those two facing pages of Liber Novus, page 145 or 43 and 44, I think it was, that, or 44 and 45 better. Those are really anima animus, it's logos and Sophia, the rational and the feminine wisdom inherent in the fact and matter of earth, above and below. So, I meant to talk a little bit more yesterday about the self, which is the next chapter. And we touched upon that a little bit yesterday, also in discussion. Jung talked in this section about coming to terms with this thing, that it is indeed sometimes found in the form of a symbol, and a symbol often that starts simply with a little dot or a circle that moves into something like a mandala. And in his journal, this is in January of 1916, as this stuff was descending upon him, this is really the first mandala Jung did, this first image, trying to understand what he'd been dealing with, these various powers above and below, star and abraxas, astra, the dark and the light, all of these various forms that had been descending upon him in his visions, in his contemplation of the visions throughout his journal over the past 2 years. Dexter, right, sinister, left, dualities, the serpent, oh, a serpent and a dove. And yesterday I was asked about anthropos, look in the middle. The A, astra, the star, astra, anthropos, a central image of wholeness at the glowing center of this vast composite of various figures. Now, Jung talked about these things, and the shadow. Let me just quote. He says, "The shadow, the syzygy, and the self are factors, psychic factors, of which an adequate picture can be formed only on the basis of a fairly thorough experience of them. Just as these concepts rose out of an experience of reality, so they can be elucidated only by further experience. That word, experience. You know, the concept is a verbal fart, a flatus voce, as Jung called it. A verbal fart, air, breathed. But when you've had the experience of the projection and seen what it was, pulled it back into yourself and seen, oh my God, this was this, then you begin to understand it. Jung went on, he says, philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in such concepts, unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts. And the concept is simply an abbreviated description or definition of these facts. And then he goes on. He goes on, he says, such criticism has little effect on the object as zoological criticism on a duck-billed platypus. Like you can criticize his concept of animus or of self or shadow philosophically, but such criticism has no effect on the fact. He continues on, it is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. And then he goes on with one important comment. Unfortunately, I cannot pass on this experience to my public, unquote. See, and I suppose that's why many people in Jungian circles thought that you couldn't understand Jung unless you'd had, well, analysis, unless you'd met the fact that the psyche is real, that these things do exist. And sometimes that takes a whole lot of probing. Some people, it's really not apparent to them. These things become, well, philosophical concepts, psychological concepts. But to you, they were based in his experience, an experience that was well documented in his Liber Novus, in his journals, and which he spoke about in veiled ways for the next 30 years. I needed to talk a bit about, Gnostic mythology. I'm going to get there real soon here. Throughout the Red Book, one sees an image of oppositions. For instance, he meets the spirit of the time at the very beginning of the book, faced by the spirit of the depths. He meets his thinking against the force of feeling, his personal red devil and the noble Christian anchorite in the desert, his heights, and his impoverished lowness, Jung's. The list goes on and on. Life and murderous death, good and evil, emptiness and fullness, absurdity and reason, seriousness and laughter. And he came to understand it was all present in him. He could not rend it apart. He realized that one is caught in the power of such oppositions unless they are experienced, realized, and met within one's own being. We harbor the opposites, and only in facing them can we find any freedom from our contradictions. Only in the union of the opposites might we find individual wholeness. But I here add, in the commentary layer of Liber Novus, another pair of opposites is drawn out. The opposites within God. And this plays a big part in the next chapters on Christ as a symbol of self on through the rest of the book. another pair of opposites is drawn out, the opposites within God. Here Jung had met the phonic, earthly spirit, the phallus, the devil below. Here's my prop again, the serpent. And in his soul, he had met the bright bird, the blinding light, the realm of deity above, the relativity of a deity, a power below. He was caught between both. In Jung's view, Christ and Satan, above and below, were brothers, but they had been separated in the Christian Aion, and the dark one had been ignored. The rending of the opposites was a wound within Christian tradition. And as a result, humankind in the West was wounded. In the first centuries of the Christian age, Christian vision had turned to the light, while the reality of evil had been ignored. And in Jung's view, absolute evil was real. Evil was the left side of God. And the human animal had rights before these oppositions. The human right could no longer be ignored. The Christian age was coming to a terminus. Human consciousness would slowly evolve in the new age, and a new form of religion would eventually find form as a reflection of that consciousness. Now you see in the, let me just go into another chapter here. As Jung dealt with his visions, as I've called them, his active imaginations, whatever you want to call them, he went looking for others who had had similar experiences across time. By looking for empirical records of others who had done what he had done. I mean, he had gone into the depths. He had heard the voice from the depths. He had met the opposites, the dualities, even within divinity. Who else had seen such things? Was he crazy? I mean, look, when these visions started between 1913 and early 1914, Jung was questioning whether indeed he had become insane or was about to be insane, psychotic. He was trying to figure out how these visions, this material, related to himself. When the war broke out in 1914, August, all of a sudden he realized that what he had been experiencing was a crisis in the Western soul. And what he had been doing was somewhat revelatory, prophetic of what was now happening in the world. He went looking for records of what had happened to him. And very early in this process in 1915, he started looking back at the earliest sources of Christianity. And he found that in early Christianity, there was a wealth of material that had been ignored by, well, orthodoxy, critiqued by orthodoxy, if you would say. And this was Gnosticism. Now, the word Gnosticism is questionable. Let us just say there were people who called themselves Gnostics, but it was not a dogma. It was an experiential fact. In early Christianity, there was a great deal of mythological vision. Some of it found its way into text. Some of it found its way into text that was then suppressed over 200 or 300 years. So because this type of Christianity, this view, turn my screen share off, I forgot to do that. Because this form of Christianity was in the 2nd century considered heretical, it became highly anathematized. Efforts were made to destroy these texts, burn them, burn the books. Something that happened around 1943. Well, let me step back and say, at that time, up until that, about the late 1900s, excuse me, the late 19th century, 1800s, all we had were the texts of the patristic fathers of the church who had talked about the Gnostics. In 1843, a collection of writings by a fellow by the name of Hippolytus, who had written in Greek, who had been very interested in Gnosticism, surfaced, Hippolytus's writings. And in this material, there was a great deal of information about Gnostic ideas. And what Jung saw in these, well, experiences, these Gnostic myths, were images of things that had been coming to him, the opposites. Jung started started reading this material in January of 1915 when he was on military duty. This is just when he was starting to transcribe the Red Book material, the first pages, the parchment pages. Then it's also been documented by Sonu Shamdasani that he was again heavily reading this material in September of 1915. And in the Red Book at this point, suddenly things, ideas, concepts, you could call them, but it's better to think of them as mirrors of his experience that he had seen at the origins of Christianity, enter into his writings. When you read his section in Aion about the Christ as an image of the self, if you look at the footnotes, where he's talking about theological statements from the past, he is continually quoting Hippolytus, who is this writer of the 3rd century, late 2nd, early 3rd century, who had cataloged a whole lot of information about Gnostic materials. Subsequently, in 1945, a huge collection of Gnostic writings was unearthed at a place called Nag Hammadi. Jung only had access to 1 or 2 texts from this during his life, and did not use this material. But if one goes through this material, you'll find that Jung actually had a pretty good idea of Gnosticism and Gnostic mythology. So Gnostic mythology actually entered into his journal at this point and became an area of deep concern for the rest of his life, up through 1945, when he had those visions that I'd spoken about. Let's see if I can move to this here. So usually when I do these lectures, I put my quotes into into a text that I can read on the screen. Right now, I'm going to turn to a section from the Black Books that Jung wrote in January 16 of 1916. This is in his journal. But this was so important that Sonu added it as a appendix to the Red Book, which is Appendix C. So Jung had been dealing with these various God images, with the things that had been coming forth from him. He'd also been dealing with an image which he called the, Abraxas in one member, but he had spoke about him in the Red Book as translated as the ruler of this world. He'd understood that in this world there was a force of evil, and there was also a force of absolute chaos, a ruler of this world. And his soul gave him this revelation, if you wish to call it that. He wrote it as such. He wrote these as the words of his soul. And in this case, his soul was speaking really in the voice of Sophia, a Sophianic voice. And this is what she told him. And this actually goes back really a bit to your question, Christoph, yesterday about, what was God's image? Who was God? Who was his God? Was it like, the image there in the Shroud of Turin? So his soul says to him, you should worship only one God. The other gods are unimportant. Abraxas, the ruler of this world, is to be feared. Therefore, it was a deliverance when he separated himself from me. Now, this is a Sophianic statement that I can only explain to you if I were to tell you the Gnostic myth of Abraxas, of the demiurge. You do not to seek him. Speaking of the Abraxas, the ruler of this world, the force of this world, you do not to seek him. He will find you, just like Eros. He is the God of the cosmos, extremely powerful and fearful. He is the creative drive. He is form and formation just as much as matter and force. Therefore, he is above all light and dark gods. He tears away souls and casts them into procreation. He is the creative and the created. He is the God who always renews himself in days and months and years in human life and ages and peoples and the living in heavenly bodies. He compels. He is unsparing. If you worship him, you increase his power over you. Thereby it becomes unbearable. You will have a dreadful trouble getting clear of him. The more you free yourself from him, the more you approach death, since he is the life of the universe. But he is also universal death. Therefore, you fall victim to him, not in life, but in dying. So remember him. Do not worship him. But also do not imagine that you can flee him, since he is all around you. You must be in the middle of life, surrounded by death on all sides, stretched out like one crucified. You hang in him, the fearful, the overpowering. But then the soul goes on and says this, but you have in you the one God, the wonderful, beautiful, and kind, the solitary, the star-like, unmoving, he who is older and wiser than the Father, he who is a safe hand, who leads you among all the darkness and death scares of Abraxas. He gives joy and peace, since he is beyond death and beyond what is subject to change. He is no friend or servant of Abraxas. that is the type of experience Jung is having as he tries to deal with what is divinity. He had come to this image of the totality of the opposites, and he was trying to deal with them. So in that section in Abraxas, or section in Aion, where he talks about Christ as a symbol of the self, he's giving a critique of the evolution of the Christian age. That in Jung's mind, there were people at the beginning of the last age, at the beginning of the Christian Aion, this period of this vast 2,000-year period, which we are now facing the end of, that there had been a mythopoetic imagination, new stories of God, a new story of Sophia, the feminine in God. And these stood as part of the body of what was arising as Christianity, but in an orthodox theological movement beginning probably around 180 and onward intensely for the next 200 years, this view, this mythological view, a very psychological view, was increasingly suppressed. Now we have actually quite a few texts from this, and there's been a whole new reevaluation of this early Christianity at this time in this world, academically as well. But Jung was saying that, look, if you look at the Christian age, what was emphasized was the light of Christ, the spiritual, the above. It was an evolution in consciousness, quite surely. But what was lost? Well, evil was lost. In early Christian writings, and this is what he argued with Father Victor White for quite a while, that there had been an denial of the fact of evil. It was called in Catholic theology, or Orthodox theology, the privatio boni, the absence of good, privation of good. In classical Orthodox theology, there was no absolute evil. There was only good. And if there was something that seemed to be evil, it was only because, well, there was an absence of good. And if you took all the good away, there was really nothing left. There was no evil. It was just the absence of good. To this, Jung argued that this is irrational. I mean, yes, of course, that is metaphysics, but it makes no sense. Well, and the problem is if there is absolute evil, that means that there must be absolute evil in divinity, which was, impossible to Orthodox theology because God was all good. Jung, in his dealing with this opposition, with this union of opposites, saw that even in divinity, in absolute form, there was evil. And if things had come forth from some form of universal prior background into this world, there had come evil, and it was real. This was anathema. And as Father Victor White pointed out, Jung was a heretic. He would not give up on this idea that evil was real. And Father White, in his, Thomas theology, could not accept that there was evil. Evil was simply a sidelight to the absence of good in this world. And if a person was evil, well, it's only because they hadn't let the good in. And if their evil was all there was really nothing there. This is the type of critique that Jung is dealing with in those sections after the one on the self. Well, Jung saw that in the evolution of this Christian age, for quite a while, the focus had been up and up and up into the bright light. But then in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, there came a change. And Jung talked about this as the Antichrist, the backside of Christ coming in. Instead of the Western vision of itself being vertical and up, a new change had happened. A horizontal axis had crossed. As those Gothic cathedrals rose higher and higher into the sky with their bright windows of light. If you look around at the stone, you see all these little beasts, gargoyles, appearing. At this point, the Western consciousness turned back to man. And this was the spirit out of which alchemy came, where instead of looking to the divine above, people were looking into matter, projecting, if you will, these images into the fact of matter, images of a transformation in matter, a union possible in matter, a wedding, a hieros gamos, a mysterium conjunctionis, a mystery of conjunction in matter and in perhaps the human. So Jung's vision of what would come in some future age was somehow we would need to come to terms with our animals, with who we are. One of the sidelights of Orthodox theology was the concept that all good comes from God. All evil comes from man. That's quite a burden for humans to bear. At some point, we need to come to terms not only with the fact of our personal evil, or shall we say our failings, our shadow, but with the fact that those things exist in our world. And this was that conjunction, that duality within the divine finding form. Throughout the Black Books from 1916 onward, in repeated sections, Jung is struggling with the evolution of the divine image in his own time and in his own perception of it. Let me just give you I've given you a very brief recension of some of this material, but let me give you an idea. I mean, for 4 decades, I've been a doctor. And at this point, I've probably seen over 125,000 patients, a lot. I mean, small city of them. And just about anything that can happen to a human being that might bring them to an emergency room, whether it be a stub toe or something beyond anything you might even believe. I've seen it. And so often when I deal with people, they ask me, but why did this happen to me? I had a patient not so long ago with a gallbladder attack, and I explained. The patient asked me, well, why did this happen to me, doc? And I explained how livers work and how gallbladders work and how gallbladders get clogged up with little stones, and then little stones get caught in the plumbing, and then it causes pain. I went through, just a very simple explanation, because most people don't know what a gallbladder is actually until it hurts. And the guy, I went through the explanation. He was sitting there nodding and nodding and nodding. And then when I was all done, he looked at me and said, yeah, but I got another question, doc. Why did this happen to me? And I realized that the question he was asking was not physiologically why it happened to me, but why was I so cursed? I have a friend recently who's been dealing with metastatic cancer. And a question that person has asked in my conversations, which have been extensive with the person, is, why did this happen to me? Was it my diet? Too much sugar? The stress in my life? Was my life too stressful for, well, how do you change that? Is that what did it? Is there something in me, my fault, my evil, my failings, that made this terrible thing happen to me? And my answer is, look, you are in the world of chaos. The ruler of this world is somewhat demonic. Good, bad. Often when people ask, when patients ask me, why did this happen to me? I, depending on the patient and whether they have a sense of humor, I said, well, I've got the good news for you. This only happens to living people. It never happens to dead people. So the reason you have this is because you're still alive. That makes some, sense to some people. So, in this evolving Gnostic mythology that Jung developed, the dualities were present. They were present at the beginning of the Christian age. This mythology of that sort was suppressed. Jung, at the beginning of this new age, had turned back to it. And that's part of what he meant in those statements that, my salvation is bringing back the old in a new time. I read that to you a little bit earlier. He really is trying to circle back to mythological things that were at the verge of the Christian age that he feels now must be met again. And part of it is actually the dualities of life, the dualities we deal with. For so long, we've blamed failings of individuals for evil without realizing that evil is actually an absolute and it has power. And we can fall, some human beings can, under that absolute power, as we have witnessed very well in, recent centuries in the history of the world. Part of the conjunctions Jung was dealing with were not only within the divine, but within us. This anima animus issue, coming to terms with the self. But even in coming to terms with the self, this totality, it was essential that we understood that even that totality was a complexio oppositorum, a merging of opposites with dark and light aspects to it. There's one other thing I just have to say about his conversations with Father Victor White, and putting vast historical context. Jung and White sitting in the tower in Bollingen is really an amusing scene. I told you that Victor White was a priest, but he was a Dominican priest. And as some of you know, the Dominicans were the Grand Inquisitors of the Middle Ages. The Dominican order started with a fellow by the name of Dominic Guzman, who had been asked by the Pope in Rome to go to the south of France and to suppress a Gnostic heresy known as the Cathar movement, which had taken over pretty much Languedoc, the south of France. And Dominic went, and it so happens that these Cathars, they were sometimes called medieval Manichaeans, an inappropriate statement, but whatever. They were dualists, a lot like Jung. They believed that this world was ruled by a nasty demon, but there was a bright star, light, to whom they turned the spirit. Dominic went to argue with them in public debates throughout the south of France. And you know what? In debate with these Christians, good Christians, they called themselves, Dominic lost every time. And this really pissed, people off, the Pope mainly, so he called a crusade about them. And to prove that they were wrong about this world being ruled by a evil demon, this crusade essentially grounded them all up after years of warfare and burned them all at the stake. Burning them at the stake was one way to prove to them that this world was not ruled by an evil demon. I guess it sort of confirmed to them something intrinsic in their theology. But you see, so here you have this Dominican priest, Grand Inquisitor, with that source, sitting in the tower with Jung, the Gnostic, dualist. And in their conversations, and actually there's a quotation, a footnote in the footnotes of Aion, where Jung says, Father White saw him as a Manichaean. He had really complained that he was a dualist, and that one of his complaints with Jung is he was a Gnostic Manichaean dualist. And Jung argued back to that point of view, and he didn't deny it. He just said, you just don't understand, which, Father White did not. So look, that was a lot. I had all this stuff prepared that I was going to present today, prepared days ago. And this morning I decided to throw it all over and just talk extemporaneously about some of these things. So I'm just going to open it up. And you guys ask me any question you want. I don't care. I'll see if I can make sense of any of the stuff I just mumbled through. And never forget the snake. He's here, folks.
So if anybody wants to face a snake, please raise your hand. Well, virtual hands easier. But Mary, you may want to unmute yourself.
So I've read Answer to Job a number of times. And one of the conclusions that I came to is that it's not just logos, but it's eros. So you have to not only analyze things and break it down, whether it's your experience or making meaning of it, it's all logos. Whether it's feeling or thinking, that's logos. But then in order to do the eros part, you need to see it as a wholeness. If I got this idea from I and Thou, Martin Buber. And so you kind of have to go back and forth between the two, I think, but maybe I'm wrong. Just
no, you got Mary. I wouldn't. I think you're on the right track here. So I put back this image here. Now, on one side you see logos.
Yes.
And the other, this, Sophia, wisdom. When you read Answer to Job, as you obviously have, what is Jung's complaint about the divinity? I mean, Answer to Job is really his most heretical work. What he says is God's unconscious. What's wrong with God? What's missing in this God? He has lost his Sophia. He's not paying attention to his wisdom. And you could say wisdom is the feeling toned aspect, the human, earthy aspect of ourselves, which speaks to us. I mean, yes, we have logos, we have rationality, and Philemon really presented that to Jung in a variety of ways. But he also had this deep sense of feeling. He was, Jung was very heady, and at a point in his life, he went through this thing which he called an antiodromia of the life type, where he started to come in contact with the feminine aspect of himself, the soulful aspect, the human aspect, the animal aspects, that these had rights. So I think, if you look at these two things as logos and Sophia, you can say that eros is the connection between them.
No, but this is a little bit different. You know how in the book of Job and Answer to Job, Job is dialoguing with God and saying, I've been a good, faithful servant. Why did you do this to me? And his friends say, oh, you must have done something wrong because God's all good and blah, blah, blah. But it's only at the end when he says, but now I see you, then everything is restored. And it's like he sees him as a wholeness. I'm not sure if it's worship, it's thou, it's an awe, it's seeing him with awe. I don't know.
Jung might have, I think Jung's approach to it in, he says, now I see you, and I put my hand to my mouth. What can I say? And Jung would say, yeah, now I see you, SOB. I mean, my friends have been telling me that, like, you're cursing me because I'm evil. Like I was talking about the patient who thinks, well, I've got a gallbladder attack because, I ate, whatever. I did something wrong. Maybe I was bad to my kids. And Jung, and this is the thing, this is the unconscious aspect of the divinity where, what Jung says, I think in Answer to Job is more like, yeah, baby, I see you, and I'm going to close my mouth while I have a chance, Now, and so what Jung was really saying is, like, if you look at this, there's this whole large section in Answer to Job about wisdom. God needs his wisdom. God needs to unify with his wisdom. And who's this wisdom? It's that Sophianic figure.
Yeah.
And Sophia is the word wisdom. So Jung is really arguing that this divine image, this Jehovah, is incomplete. And that was part of his, dualistic heresy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, it makes sense. I understand what his theory that that's what caused Jehovah to send Christ later so that he could gain some of man's consciousness. Yes.
Exactly. And you see, that was what Jung was looking at in the early Christian period at the image of the Christ figure, is that this was an image of wholeness. But that wholeness, Christ cursed the fig tree. Christ's disciples stole a donkey so he could ride into Jerusalem, to be, crowned king and then crucified. I mean, there was darkness. And at the end of it all, what does he say? Lord, why have you forsaken me?
Yes.
Right? How human.
Right.
I mean, Jung is saying, if you look at this image of the Christ and some of the approaches to it, not only of Christ, but the mythology, because there was a vast mythology that developed between about 100 BC and maybe the second century AD of the Sophianic myth. I gave a big seminar about this. If any of you want to watch it, it's on my webpage. And the Sophianic figure and the myth of this Sophia as the sidekick, the necessary syzygy to the Logos, is intrinsic in Gnostic mythology during this period. It's it's a keynote of Gnostic mythology. And I mean, the two elements, the classic, in talking in academic terms, the two classic characteristics of Gnostic mythology as presently approached by modern historians and, theologians, not theologians, but, historians of early Christianity, is that there was this belief that there was actually an evil demon in this world, the ruler of this world, who was not so good and even not even conscious, really. And there was a Sophianic spirit. And it's that Sophianic myth which really denoted early Gnostic texts, which were largely destroyed, not entirely. Jung ultimately had access to a good deal of this mythology. Okay, let me move on again before we run out of time.
John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you. You spoke so eloquently again about opposites, warring opposites, united opposites, and how it's a recurring major theme in Jung's thought. I just wanted to ask if you could speak a bit about Jung's concept of the transcendent function and where you feel it does or doesn't fit into any or all of what you're talking about in terms of opposites, either on an individual or collective level.
Okay, that's a really good question. And it's really apropos to the stuff I've been talking about with regard to the Red Book. The transcendent function was an essay that Jung wrote around 1916, right in the middle of this, all this theological stuff I was just talking about in the Black books. And if you read the lecture, the paper carefully, in consort with what was happening in his life right then, you'll understand that when he talked about the transcendent function, he was actually talking about the ability to enter into the imaginal mythopoetic realm. Now, one could talk about this as active imagination as it came to be understood later in Jungian practice. But for Jung at this point, if you look at his letters, his writings, and what was going on with him, the transcendent function was the ability to enter into the visionary, the mythological, as he had very much done during this period. He felt that he had met, as he wrote at exactly the time he wrote that in two collected papers, that he had found a spring of living water. And what was that spring of living water? It was his ability to meet the mythopoetic imagination, to allow this stuff to open to him, allow him to meet things like Philemon, to meet Elijah and Salome, these various images that he had been going through in his black books that he was at that very moment transcribing into this big red book, those images that he was working on. This was a key figure. So people have read the transcendent function paper in various ways. But, I think it was actually in the Yale lectures that Jung gave. I think they're called, the Terry lectures. Jung talked about this. And people have said, well, it has been said that the, dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. And Jung said, no, actually, the royal road is imagination, fantasy. Because you see, when we enter into imaginative realms in consciousness, in awakeness, it's much more apparent. We're there with it. If you dream, you wake in the morning with a fragment. But if you're able to enter into this imaginal world in awakeness, and that is exactly what Jung was doing. And he said this quite clearly, talking about this, that what he was doing was allowing images to appear as they might in dream while meeting them in awake consciousness. And that's really what he felt he had been doing, meeting them in awakened consciousness. Now, this is an entirely different realm. It's like walking into a dream world awake. And that's what he felt he had done. And certainly in that section of the Red Book called as the Mysterium, that first big, crossing the threshold of the doors of perception, he really was there with Elijah, with Salome, with all those images. So, now Jung very much hoped that he could help other people find that. And he talked about that as being, that fantasy, imagination, mythopoetic imagination were keys to meeting some of the depths of the psyche. Very few people, in my experience, are able to do that. And Jung also talked about when he was doing this, what he had to do. He had to clear his consciousness. And before the first of those visions started coming in December 1913, he sat for 25 nights, feeling like he was in a parched desert, emptiness. And slowly words came to him. He records this in his journals. It's in the Red Book. Words like, listen to the depths, hear the words of the depths. And there he is, just, like trying to clear his consciousness. And then it was around December 12th where, the threshold of vision really started. He said the way he got to it, I'll just throw this in. He told this in his 1925 lecture. He said, he knew that fantasy might evoke more fantasy. So he sat at his desk and he imagined himself digging a hole, digging. And he put all of his consciousness into this image of him imaginatively digging a hole, to the point where he could feel the shovel. He could feel the dirt going over his shoulder as he dug deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper down. And then finally, suddenly in his fantasy, a passage opened up. He thought it was an old mine. He walked into it. There was a withered dwarf at the door. Inside, there was muck on the floor. He heard screeching voices. There was a gem glowing in an alcove in the cave. He went up, he picked the gem up. He looked inside, and down below there was a streaming river. And first, there floated by a dead hero with a wound in his head. And then a scarab. And then a sun deep in the waters. And snakes came flowing down off the walls and surrounded the sun. And Jung tried to put he's looking in this hole, tried to put the gem back on the hole, and spurts of blood came streaming out. And Jung, told his 1925 seminar, which was a group of people who knew him pretty well. He said, my technique had worked extremely well, but I hadn't the foggiest idea what had happened. He had really reached this, this threshold of imagination. And then that really broke open intensely on December 22nd, 10 days later, with that section in the Red Books known as the Mysterium. So, I guess in summary to what you're stating, if I can bring it back, what does the transcendent function have to do with this stuff? Everything as a source.
I've often heard people describe or try to describe the transcendent function as simply one's ability to unite opposite energies in one's psyche. Do you think that's a distortion or a misleading oversimplification then of the it's a soundbite I hear about the transcendent function, and what you're saying is so much more.
Well, yeah, it's a soundbite. And it's actually a misunderstanding that is perhaps all that was available to people who had no understanding of the Red Book, didn't have his journals, didn't know what the man had been doing in 1916. I mean, if you put it into a conceptual, those verbal farts of concepts. So here he is, he's dealing, talking about, unifying the opposites. Well, what's the opposite? Rationality and irrationality. Sense and nonsense. Those are opposites. And what was Jung doing? Well, in his vision, some of this stuff seemed to him like nonsense. He was bringing sense and facing nonsense. He was bringing the rational to the absurd. So there was actually very much that sort of a unification of the different issues present. And so, to say it's about the union of the opposites, that's like, sure, yeah, okay, that's true. And what were the opposites? Unconscious, the dark, the fullness and depth of the psyche with the conscious awakeness of the human mind. Really? Yeah, those are opposites. And he was meeting them. That was part of his nature.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lucy, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you for this time. It's just been revolutionary or revealing or
well, the new Aion, yeah, this whole idea of a new Aion, it's very revolutionary. It's zodiacally revolutionary.
Yeah, I'm just really grateful to this experience and being at the Institute and learning so much. Having similar experiences to Jung, and thinking that, okay, I'm losing my mind here, right? I'm losing my mind. I don't tell anybody about this, and having the permission to actually talk about it and enter into it, right? So the way I understand it is just letting go of the ego and the senses, the human senses, and entering into a space of nonsense that seems like nonsense, and the imagery and all of these things and the wisdom that comes through that. It's just letting go of the grandiosity and it seems grandiose getting on the other side because you're contending with the unknown, but actually letting go of the grandiosity of human power and letting go of that and transcending into that space is just incredible to me. And I could see how the like having it be hidden and not sharing it with people, right? If this is sort of, where am I tapping into? What is this space that I'm tapping into? Even though it's just completely real, I'm fully awake, I'm fully present in my mind, but what is this space that I'm tapping into and the wisdom that comes through? And also with the thing with Job, I've been in Job for 10 years. I feel like it's been a Job experience for 10 years. So physical health, mental health, loss of pets, family, constantly having a loss, and having to tap into that place of when that despair creates a conscious contact with this other space, other realm, that abandoning the human to contact with that. And also,
I would say that, in comment to that, it's very lonely. What you're just describing, I've just heard you say that, and you can think that you're going crazy. And Jung very definitely thought he was going crazy during these early visions. He says that very clearly, like, maybe I'm a madman. This is before, he started doing his critique of the material in later 1914 after the war broke out. But I say, it is important to have somebody to talk to. And Jung did actually have somebody. He talked to his wife. And then, of course, Toni Wolff was a very important person to him because she understood. She somehow brought this stuff out he brought stuff out in her too, but she was a companion. So when you're going through this stuff, having somebody you can talk to is necessary. The problem is,
I love the way he meticulously documented. And the funny thing about these types of experiences, I know if he were to write it again today, if he was alive, he would not have forgotten it, because that's what I noticed. That type of, my dreams I may forget, but those experiences are sort of typed up, permanently fixed in a place that is not movable.
well, that's what Jung actually said to patients, is that you should take these things and write your own precious book. Write your own red book. And
it's a personal experience. It's not even what Jung experienced. The image
of course
is very different than my own imagery, because it's coming from my own human experience and what I'm able to see through.
actually, and that's the part of the whole issue of this coming to terms with these things. It's yours. And that's, you know, people say, well, you know, this is Jung's book. Indeed, it is Jung's book. You have yours. This has a whole lot in it that, you know, I think very few people will go through. I mean, Jung, in his analytic process, worked with many, many people with this concept of active imagination, just what you're talking about. And many of them had extremely interesting experiences. And they recorded them. And Jung kept copies of all the pictures that they did, recording their experiences over the years. So, you know, he was aware of this. However, I would say in perspective, Jung was extraordinary. What happened to him was really, I really think, was an age-defining event, as dear Ed Edinger, who almost killed me with his lectures on the Streumkonjunktion, once said. I mean, Jung really was an amazing figure at the beginning of this age. Okay, our time is running out. Let me take as many questions more as I can.
I would like to add something, please, especially in response to John. I'm sorry, is it my turn or no?
You're on.
Okay, thank you. The transformative function. The Institute adds another perspective beyond what we are talking about at the moment. The transformative function is a natural process that is going on anadromically, reciprocally all the time in terms of our natural development. Now, what we have been talking about is the active imagination is the synthetic process that Jung found that was able to replicate this process that goes on for our development. Even if we're not conscious of it, we can be conscious of it. It goes on through childhood development. It goes on through our adulthood development. It goes on through the healing process. And its language is the symbols. The process is transformative, but there is a dialogic process between the conscious and the unconscious that is constantly bringing us up to the third that neither the consciousness nor the unconscious recognize at the moment. They synthesize into an aso moment. I think picturesque in terms of a picture of this process is the yin yang I Ching circle that shows a light and a dark side that are constantly weaving back and forth. And within them, there are opposing dark and light. Within the light, there's a dark, and within the light, there's a dark. And when this dialogic process becomes so skewed, this endogenic process is going to reverse itself into the opposite. And this is the unconscious cosmic process that consciousness cannot overcome. We may try to do it, but we can't by self-will. So I don't know, John, if that means anything, But
Well, you know,
the
that
active
whole,
imagination is a synthetic process. It's not the natural process.
yes, that one might say that. But at the same time, sometimes even in nature, people have visions that they don't expect. You know, so you can say that the synthetic process, it might be synthesizing in the sense of bringing or creating the new. That's a synthesis. That people actually do sometimes have these visionary experiences they didn't see,
Oh,
they didn't try for it, it just happened. But
right.
this whole idea that, yeah, this whole idea of the yin and yang, well, that was very important to Jung. He talks about it quite a bit in the book, that image of the conjunction there. But let me go on. We got plenty of other people here. So, Christoph.
Gordon, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello, thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Lance, thank you so much for going on. And I would like to, if I could, guide you or ask you to talk somewhat about the latter parts of Aion, especially chapter 14. Although in the way Jung brings up the remora and the magnetism of the teaching and how the teaching has a purpose of its own. And, you know, this wonderful elaboration. And I thought you must have some thoughts about what particular needs Jung is fulfilling in himself by going so deep into Gnostic symbology, especially that 4x4 table chapter at the end there. I mean, von Franz did a whole book on that.
Yeah, she did.
Which I didn't, you know, it's, the textual material is fascinating, but what's it all mean? You know?
Okay. Well, dear Dr. von Franz did a whole series of seminars on it, so I'm not going to do it in 5 minutes. But you're talking about what he's talking about is chapter 14, the structure and dynamics of the self, and the chapter just before that is titled Gnostic Symbols of the Self. And these are actually the most important chapters to me that I wanted to talk about in detail. And then it became quite clear. Yeah, okay, I've got what, 20 minutes left? I don't think I'm going to do it. I mean, really, when I started this lecture, I had notes that went, you know, yeah, through all this stuff. And I really intended today to get to talking about just those two chapters. But let me just give you the first words out of, you know, the chapter 14. And here, this is what he says. From various hints dropped by Hippolytus, it is clear beyond a doubt that many of the Gnostics were nothing other than psychologists. Thus, he reports them as saying that the soul is very hard to find and to comprehend, and that knowledge of the whole man is just as difficult. For knowledge of man is the beginning of wholeness. But knowledge of God is perfect wholeness. Well, okay, so that comment, like the Gnostics were really psychologists. At the very beginning of Aion, he puts a statement in saying that for the key, the secret of the early Gnostics was that for them, the psyche was a source of knowledge. The psyche was a source of knowledge. Now, how do we say that? Well, the psyche could bring forth mythopoetic things. I mean, myths, right? The myth of Sophia went through this vast transformation over 200 years there, or 300 years in the early period of the beginning of the Christian age. And it started really in Jewish mysticism with the story of Sophia and Philo and others. So she was the one who was at the right hand of God. She, you know, without her, the Lord created nothing, it says in the Bible, in the Wisdom of Solomon. So there was this mythopoetic movement there. And what Jung found fascinating in the writings of the Gnostics that were available to him was the fact that they seemed to approach these things in a psychological fashion. In other words, all these images and things that came out, he would look at this stuff and say, my God, it seems like they must have had experiences like mine that they were expressing in some of this material that they were writing. Now, not all the Gnostic writings are myths. Some are clearly exegeses on their thoughts. And at that time, Jung really had one principal source of early Christian Gnostic thought, and that was the writings of a fellow by the name of Hippolytus, who I mentioned earlier somewhere in my ramblings. The writings of Hippolytus had been found around 1843 at the the Greek monastery on Mount Athos. They had been translated into Latin. They were in Greek originally, into Latin, and then English after about 1856. This material was really a profound re-entry into understanding of what Gnosticism had been, because most of these writings had been destroyed by other of the early Orthodox fathers. And actually, Jung's feeling was, and he told this to Marie-Louise von Franz, and Marie-Louise von Franz told it to Dr. Ribby, who's a good friend of mine. I edited a couple of his books and published them. But anyway, Marie-Louise von Franz told Dr. Ribby that Jung believed that Hippolytus had actually been a Gnostic, in the closet Gnostic, that he had understood these people and recorded so much of their material in his writings that we now have, that he must have been a Gnostic. He was so fascinated by this material. And it is, so if you look at this material as an active imagination, say in analysis, and see what it's dealing with, Jung would say, look, these people are really getting some wisdom from a psychic, from an interior, visionary source. They're taking it real. They are psychologists. And for them, the psyche is a source of knowledge, which, I think that's pretty key for Jung. I mean, a lot of the stuff in the Red Book and the Black Books was psychic. It was a source of knowledge that came to him from a place which he called autonomous to himself, independent, and infinitely ancient, timeless perhaps. It was coming to him. Philemon, his master, once upon a time, he supposed in vision that Philemon had been Simon Magus, the first Gnostic, as so proclaimed by Irenaeus in around 180 AD. So there's a channel of this stream that goes back. The point is the reason he was interested in these people and this emergence of mythological material in early Gnosticism and its approach, which appeared to him at least psychological, is not because it was there. It's by when it happened. It happened at the beginning of this age of the fish, Pisces, the age of the Christian millennia, which he saw now changing. And where did he stand? He stood in this circle of time, right? The circle of the aeons, of the ages. He stood at the beginning of a new age. And now the psyche was erupting again, and it was erupting in him. And he thought perhaps eventually in others as well, that would be a source of knowledge. The psyche would be a source of knowledge about what it was to be human. And the other thing one has to understand is that, in the Christ figure and other figures of such nature across history, Jung felt that something in us which was ineffably ancient, perhaps timeless, primordial, was present in us. It was trying to speak through us, through these human animals with souls, their buried treasure in the field, was trying to bring us to awareness of what we were. That psyche was not just something for psychologists. Psyche was a fact. It's a fact that perfused the universe, perhaps went back before the universe, and is in us. And before we exterminate ourselves with our rationality, with our materiality, perhaps we should take note of the fact that we're more than matter, more than rationality, more than our metaphysics, that we are really sparks of a light in a dark matrix of cosmos. And to him, Jung, that was his star. That central star was that light that he knew was in the human. And in this coming new age, I guess his great hope would be that that light might shine more brightly, that we might come to knowledge of our opposites and bring them into some sort of conjunctio. So like in that very complex section on, he goes through all these images, the quaternities and things. I won't even begin to try to talk about that because, good heavens, Dr. von Franz took quite a while talking about it.
No, they're fast. Oh, I was just going to say they're fascinating to me. And I do tie them in with the comment that Jung made in his commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where he actually comes out and states that individuation, or the individuation process, is a Western form of yoga, and an enlightenment process, which is something that was very gratifying to me. I stumbled across, I don't know, decades ago now, that we're actually, there is a path. Individuation is a yoga, or like a path. And then in teaching, I mean, Aion, the way Jung interprets the Gnostics, I mean, there's such a hint of he's writing his own book of sacred scripture and sharing I mean, it's a sort of, because you just keep getting deeper and deeper into the weeds, but the weeds are numinous and they're glowing, and there are jewels. I think you did.
Well, thank you for talking a bit about that. But with regard to Jung, I mean, look, I have many friends and acquaintances that are analysts like yourselves here, and some who are very rational. I even know people who are really entranced with Wolfgang Giegring, who I'm not fond of, who is very rational, very philosophical. And when I talk about Jung, sometimes they cringe, as they did 30 years ago in New York, or 35, 40 years ago, about dear Edward Edinger talking about Jung as he did. Sometimes people say, well, you're talking about Jung as if he is a prophet. Now, Edinger talked about this, like, he is the founding father of a new age. Well, maybe. He did write this book, and you know what he called it? The New Book. Like Old Testament, New Testament, the New Book. Well, look at it. It's like, he didn't finish it. He tried, and he never told anyone, never showed it to anyone outside of a very select group of people during his life, but he handed it on to his family 60 years after, or 50 years after his death. Finally, Jung's son, Franz Jung, was quite opposed to the publication of the Red Book. And certainly the Black Books, good heavens. But because, he was afraid people wouldn't understand. Within Jung's family, and I've met over the years several of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren at this point, Jung was really seen as a fairly extraordinary figure. I can't even really repeat some of the things that have been told me about feelings in the family about him, but he was seen in somewhat prophetic light by his own family. And that's one reason why they've always been, over these years, very, very cautious about sharing some of his most intimate material. And I suspect that fact was behind their hesitance to publish those last 65 pages of the last journal, Journal 7, where I believe, I intuit strongly that Jung talked about his near-death experiences in 44, which were an extraordinary event, as Barbara Hanna called it.
Hey, do you think they might have bridged over into the world of the supernatural, so-called supernatural? Is that part of the shyness?
I can't tell you because I haven't seen them in my own, and the fact that they exist is my intuition. I can't tell you that I know that. I have reason to think it, but I don't know it. And what do they deal with? I mean, I've collected all of Jung's accounts of these visions. They appeared in many places in conversations with others, in things he wrote, in letters. He talked about many of these things. And I have a collection of all the things, but if you put them in mass, in some, it was quite a bit of writing. And I suspect that those were there. And he called them, he said these were, entirely objective. There was nothing imaginative about them. Nothing imaginative about them, entirely objective. They were real. He had entered into this visionary state. And as is, you'll remember as his illness at the end of 44, resolved, as it became apparent to him that he didn't get to die. I mean, in fact, he was quite ready to hit the road. As it became apparent to him that he was going to have to stick around, he said he entered a deep depression because he knew he had to go back into the world of the little boxes, the little dreary boxes. He had to go back into his little box, all these little dreary boxes hanging by strings, when he had actually been in the realm of the ineffable, the realm of the divine, of the timeless, where time ended, where there was no past, no present, no future, as he described it. He was there. And now he came back into his little box. And what did he do when he got back in the little box? It's like, shit, I've got work to do still. There are still things remaining to me. And that's when he undertook to write this book, Aion, which, look, again, I got to tell you, I wanted to tell you everything about it. Just make it entirely, completely clear to you what this was about. And I realized I was going to fail, human failure. All I could do is just give you dabbles of it. And, reading this is difficult stuff. I've read it several times, and I read it again for this, seminar, trying to pick out quotations and things I'd give you. And I have a whole 2 more PowerPoint slides, slideshows of them, and, tens of thousands more word of text, which I found out trying to give you the first lecture is really hard to do. So didn't want to send you, like Edinger did, off the edge of the road, asleep with all the rest of it. So
no, but maybe you'll come back and share some more of this material.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, okay, we'll see. We'll see.
Put it on your website.
Look, what I have to say is, talking into this damn computer is hard. I mean, because as I've said before, is when you're with people and looking at them, I get vibes. Psyche talks out of the room. All of a sudden, you just feel an intuition of what has to come next because somebody has sent you that message. I don't know how you do that. I mean, it's, whatever. Spooky, right? And any of you who have been, in an analysis or doing analysis know that sometimes you just know what you have to say. You feel what is the needed thing. When I'm looking at the computer screen, I have a really hard time with that. So, okay, Christoph, next.
Yeah, Ed, would you like to ask your question? You might need to unmute yourself first. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Lance, when you were talking about there being something in us, that brought to mind an image I saw many years ago in a profound inner vision experience. There were many images in this experience. One of them was this risen Christ figure. Mm-hmm. The image is ineffable, beautiful. And I was looking at him, trying to figure out what I was seeing. We were face to face. Mm-hmm. And there was this ball of light in his chest. And I kept looking at it and I was wondering, what in the world is that? And the word vita popped into my mind. And I knew
Say that again.
Vita.
Oh,
That
vita.
word popped into my mind from who knows where.
Mhm.
And I knew immediately I was looking at an image of life itself. And what was very unusual about this image, and maybe this has something to do with, you know what, maybe I had a glimpse of what it is that is to come, perhaps, because this risen Christ figure was wearing my best suit, and he was wearing my best shoes, and he looked a little bit like me. If I were superhuman, if I were divine, and I'm just wondering if what is to come is this knowledge that we are reality itself in the form of individual human beings. We are, each one of us is an incarnation, or is God himself or herself in the form of an individual human being. So the switch, you know, Jesus carried the projection of that, and now we're waking up to that's us. You know, in part, we also have the shadow stuff, of course.
Well,
And-
Christ had the shower too. I mean, look, what you're describing is very much what Jung was saying in the Red Book. He said, now, Christ has done his work. Now each man must do his own. The Christ within was the issue. You must be Christ's. No more Christianity, no more Christians, Christ's. And what you're describing is very much that. Now, this is getting into mythic, well, deep mythic psychic material. I mean, as this experience often, well, was for you and sometimes is. And I got to tell you, I've had moments of similar perceptions over the years. That the real, I mean, that's what Jung said. I started with that quote at the beginning. Man has a soul, and there's a buried treasure in the field. The soul, the psyche, and there's a buried treasure. And that treasure is actually the divine image of God itself, which we have projected out in 1,000 different ways. And that thing that you just said about taking the projection back, that was exactly what Jung was talking about in this age. We need to quit putting the perception of the divine out there or down there. I mean, there are people who worship down there, who have given up with up there, because up there is up there, down here, well, we're down here, right? And understanding that there's something in us that is actually a seed of light. And that's, this issue, if you look through Jung's materials, I read you that prophecy or that revelation of his soul to him in 16 January 1916, where he says, you have the one God inside of you. That's your star. And this star of Jung, this bright light of you, is that central. When you talked about that light you saw in you and said it was vita, that was very much the life, not just a life, but life eternal, life without limitation of the realm of this world, which one would hope one might at some point meet again. There's an old, analyst, Jungian analyst who knew Jung very well. He lived up in Ohio. A lot of people know where that is. I won't mention his name because it's private. But there are a couple of nurses, young nurses, who were taking care of him during the end of his life. And they told a friend of mine, who was a very good friend of this individual, that the nurses told him that he was so happy. He was excited, knowing that he would soon die. And these nurses were so impressed by his attitude, which was, now I get to find out this thing I've been interested in all these years. I get to see, which, well, if you're going to die, you might as well approach it with that sort of idea that it is an exploration. into all the mysteries that you did not know and wished to know.
Well, I think it was the last question. It was a deeply rich program. I think it's going to take time to assimilate this, especially the last part. Well, thank you so much, Lance. Now, I hope
And Christoph,
you
can I make one other comment?
go ahead.
So this was a verbal and somewhat, well, almost entirely extemporaneous session. When I write stuff, I tend to write very academic, or try to anyway. And believe me, I footnote everything as best I can, because I want to make sure that people understand that I'm not making stuff up, that what I have to say has foundation in sources, documents, and facts. But it's impossible to put all the footnotes and the academic writing into a lecture such as this. As I've found over the years, I just have to talk, okay? But if you put my name into Google, and I use my middle initial in everything I publish, Lance S for Stuart Owens, if you just put my name in Google, you'll find a ton of stuff. And if you're interested in any of this, I mean, there are papers there, the first one on the hermeneutics of vision, Jung's and Liber Novus. There's the Jung in Love, the Mysterium in Conjunctionis, the huge, I talked about Gnosticism. You asked me about that, Christoph, and I wrote the major foreword to Dr. Ribby's book, The Search for Roots. I edited the book, I published the book too, but I also wrote the foreword, which is about 35 pages long. And actually Sonu actually footnoted that introduction on Gnosticism in his edition of the Red Book. That if you really want to understand the Gnostic sources better, that's a good place. My paper, of course, in Psychological Perspectives on Jung and Aion, Time, Vision, and Wayfaring Man, that was a big one for me. And that my first lecture was very much, my re-entering into that world of that paper that I wrote 11 years ago. So if you want more and in detail with the footnotes, Google's your friend. Hey, and so folks, thank you so much. Christoph.
Thank you.